Good morning, everyone. In today's lecture, we will be looking at the position of Great Britain going into 1789. Britain would prove to be revolutionary France's greatest enemy, and the country would emerge from the conflict with France as the world's premier superpower for the next 100 years. Great Britain was a relatively young nation in 1789. It had formed from a merger of the Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of Scotland in 1707. This is known as the Act of Union. Despite being bitter enemies during the medieval period, for the century before the Act of Union, England and Scotland had been ruled by the same ruling house, the House of Stuart. The Act of Union combined the parliaments of both nations together, with both the Scottish and the British nobility sitting together in the Parliament in Westminster, in London, England, the seat of power in the new country. Parliament had established its supremacy in the Civil War of the 1640s. This extremely violent conflict, fought over the four countries that make up the British Isles, so that's England, Scotland, Wales and Ireland, started from the high-handedness of the King, Charles I's, treatment of Parliament, as well as fears that he was secretly a Catholic. The war resulted in the defeat of the King and his execution, 150 years before the execution of Louis XVI. After a decade of dictatorship under the Puritan military commander Oliver Cromwell, who launched an invasion of Ireland that resulted in a third of the population there being killed, the monarchy was restored under Charles's son, also Charles. Charles II battled with Parliament for control over the country. Control was only passed fully to Parliament in the so-called Glorious Revolution, when Charles's brother, King James, was driven off of the throne for being openly Catholic, as well as espousing the doctrines of absolute monarchy that were all the rage in Europe at the time. James's replacement was the Protestant Dutchman William of Orange, who defeated the deposed king at the Battle of the Boyne in Ireland a couple of years later. This victory is still celebrated by many Irish Protestants and loyalists to British rule, which is why the colour orange remains associated with loyalism in Northern Ireland to this day. Parallel to the civil wars and religious conflicts in Britain, the 17th century had also seen the expansion of English and Scottish colonies abroad and the gradual emergence of a colonial empire. The most valuable colonies were found in the Caribbean, and the capture of Jamaica from Spain in 1655 solidified English presence in this region. The Caribbean islands were valuable as their climate was perfect for the cultivation of sugarcane, which could then be ground down and refined to create a sweet product. The tastiness of sugar made it very valuable, meaning that it could be sold in Europe for vast profits. Meanwhile, labor costs were low due to the extensive exploitation of slave labor, with slaves being shipped to the Caribbean from West Africa. This slave trade was itself extremely valuable, especially as slave traders packed their ships with as many slaves as they could during the so-called Middle Passage. Together, the wealth generated by slavery and sugar greatly increased the power of English and Scottish merchants in their societies, and taxes and investments from their wealth began to make Great Britain a very wealthy island. Another area of colonial expansion was continental North America. After launching a series of failed colonies, English settlers finally achieved two self-sufficient colonies in Newfoundland and in Plymouth. For the next century, the English arrived in their new North American colonies in increasing numbers, many fleeing religious persecution. These settlers were also hungry for land, and their encroachments against the native people of the region led to a series of wars. The colonists won these wars and expanded ever southwards and westwards until they run up against the forts of New France, as we have seen in our 7 Years' War lecture. Whilst these new 13 colonies were not big money earners for Great Britain, as they were not taxed, They provided a market for British goods, and the merchants of the colonies played an important role in the web of British trade that stretched round the globe. Many Scots viewed English colonial efforts with jealousy, and worried that the money pouring into English port cities from across the globe would tip the balance of power between the two kingdoms decisively in favour of the English. As a result, Scotland launched its own colonial effort, the Darion Scheme, to launch a colony of New Caledonia in today's Panama. To raise money for the scheme, its leaders procured investments from numerous Scots from all social strata throughout the kingdom. Altogether, 20% of the entire wealth in Scotland at the time was invested in the scheme. It was therefore an absolute disaster for Scotland when the scheme failed. The failure of the Darion scheme resulted from a number of reasons, including an English trade embargo, Spanish military attacks, and native hostility. But there is no question that the poverty caused by this failure made the Act of Union 7 years later possible, as Scotland found itself suddenly bankrupt. Scotland's weakness also made the terms of unification harsh on that country. There was to be, for example, no separate Scottish Parliament until devolution in the 1990s. Many Scots felt that the Act of Union represented a hostile takeover by a foreign nation, rather than a union of brothers or even an alliance of convenience as many English saw it. Unification was hardly the end of Britain's problems, as the new nation remained riven by conflict. In particular, supporters of the old Stuart kings remained throughout the country, but particularly in the Catholic fringe areas of Ireland and northern Scotland. Twice, these supporters, the Jacobites, launched insurrections to return the Stuart dynasty to the British throne. The second of these uprisings, depicted in the book and television series Outlander, started in the Highlands of Scotland and got as far as Derby in England before being driven back and defeated. The British military cracked down on the uprising brutally and began to institute a policy of clearances, where Highlanders were driven off their land, which was then handed over to nobles or lairds, who used the land to rear sheep and cows, whilst the unfortunate Highlanders were forced to eke out an existence on the coasts or emigrate to North America. Although Parliament had achieved supremacy over the king, the royal family still mattered in Britain. The ruling dynasty were now the Hanoverian dynasty of George I, II, III, and IV from Hanover in northern Germany. These Georgian kings were divided between their loyalties to Britain and their German lands. George I, for example, despised England and went back to Hanover whenever he could. By the time of George III, Britain had clearly become the more valuable of the two states, but George III's well-documented madness presented its own set of problems for the kingdom. As a result of the monarchy's absence or its weakness, Parliament was able to assume more and more power. Slowly, a system developed where the most powerful member of Parliament became known as a Prime Minister, a powerful figure who largely shaped policy by arranging new laws to be presented to and passed in the Parliament. The first Prime Minister, Robert Walpole, dominated British politics for an entire 20-year period and remains the longest-lasting Prime Minister to this day. The Georgian king's connection to Germany drew Britain far closer to continental European politics than many British people were comfortable with. In the first half of the 18th century, the country engaged in a series of conflicts with European powers, mostly France and Spain, in order to protect the German holdings and prevent any European power from becoming too large and thus threatening the British Isles. Warring with France, Spain, and the Dutch had the added bonus of allowing Britain to pick up small pieces of all three countries' colonial empires. From Spain, Britain even conquered the small Rock of Gibraltar at the entrance to the Mediterranean, turning the area into a British fortress. This conquest gave Britain a strategic base in the Mediterranean, which the British were able to exploit thanks to their greatest weapon, the Royal Navy. After the union of Scotland and England, both countries could no longer be threatened by a land invasion, and so Britain turned its focus to its navy, which quickly became one of the largest in Europe, its fighting ability matched only by the Spanish, French, and the Dutch. British naval might meant that the country waged war differently to any other European power. Maintaining only a small standing army, Britain would slowly cripple its enemies by winning battles at sea and slowly draining their economy. Britain's own economy would be unaffected due to its modern banking system, which allowed the government to raise massive amounts of loans and thus put more ships to sea, starving its enemies further, etc. These tactics were extremely successful in the 7 Years' War, as we have seen. Victory in this war left Britain as the strongest European empire on the world stage, the undisputed master of India, the Caribbean, and for 20 years the eastern seaboard of North America. An unusually high literacy rate facilitated the widespread embrace of Enlightenment ideas in Britain, particularly in London and Edinburgh, cities which were major printing and publishing centres. The university towns of Cambridge and Oxford, as well as Edinburgh again, became centres of cutting-edge philosophy and natural science, both of which developed along different lines than continental philosophy. The British scholars were particularly interested in mathematics, rationalism, and systems of logic, which they sought to apply to everything from agricultural techniques to free trade and the rule of law. Famous thinkers from the English and Scottish Enlightenments include Isaac Newton, John Locke, David Hume, and Adam Smith. For the first time, English began to challenge French as a language of culture and philosophy, and even surpassed French as a language of business. The 18th century also saw the birth of the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain. Whilst Britain was already, in 1700, more industrialised and urbanised than its European rivals, the 18th century saw a massive rise in economic growth in the country. The increasing use of steam power, and thus the elaborate machinery that constituted the Industrial Revolution, was made possible by Britain's massive deposits of the precious rock, coal, which burned for a far longer time than wood despite being much smaller, making it a fantastic energy source. On top of this, Britain was a relatively small country with an extremely dense system of rivers and canals, which made transporting goods from the interior of the country to its large merchant ports easy. Britain could make goods thanks to coal and ship them thanks to its rivers and its docks. Despite bringing immense wealth to the country, industrialization also brought with it brutal conditions of work, including child labor. Industrial safety was minimal, and pollution and machines led to horrific injuries. Workers were easy to replace, however, thanks to the rapid population growth. In 1770, the population of Britain was about 8.3 million. By 1790, it had already reached 9.7 million. By 1811, it had become 12 million. Whilst Britain emerged from the 7 Years' War as Europe's strongest power, an event soon occurred to bring British pride back down to earth: the American Revolution. Britain had treated its colonial possessions in North America with disdain, denying colonists the ability to influence national policy, and forcing them to buy British goods with higher import taxes. These measures increased after the 7 Years' War, as Britain looked to the colonies as a way of paying back its numerous war debts. Moreover, the British government also prohibited the settlement of Native American land to the west of the colonies, and even began to tax the colonists directly, for example through taxation of stamps. Whilst these taxes were only a 20th of those given to mainland Britons, they were enough for the colonies to rebel. Whilst the war at first went well for Britain, the intervention of Spain, France, and the Netherlands on the side of the colonies was decisive. By the close of 1780, it had become apparent that the war in the 13 colonies had been lost, and the Prime Minister begged the King to end the conflict. The Prime Minister's call for peace was backed by merchants in the cities of London, Glasgow, and Bristol, who needed trade with North America to resume as soon as possible. The King, however, refused, and it took complete disaster at the Battle of Yorktown for hostilities to come to an end. The loss of the 13 colonies hurt British pride and convinced many that Britain's decline was imminent. However, In the 1780s, the country made a remarkable recovery. Under the rule of a 24-year-old Prime Minister, William Pitt the Younger, Britain cut its debts by half, buoyed by a massive increase in manufactured goods that continued to flood the market of its colonies and of the new United States of America. The administration was slimmed down and made more efficient, both at home and in the colonies. Control over India, as well as economic exploitation of the subcontinent, was increased. Britain went into 1789 reinvigorated and wealthy, having just signed an alliance with its old enemy, the Netherlands, and its ally from the 7 Years' War, Prussia. It would prove to be the greatest enemy of revolutionary France, and would eventually ensure the latter's defeat.